So, what is it like to be a journalist of color covering the Black Lives Matter protests and other stories about racial injustice? Are you expected to separate personal experience from professional reporting? I pose these questions and more to journalists Katrease Stafford of the Associated Press and Olivia Lewis from Bridge Detroit. The murder of George Floyd has reverberated in cities all over the nation, including Detroit. How do you feel about the coverage of perhaps the largest modern civil rights movement is being covered by media organizations in the city and around the United States? Kat, we'll start with you.
I kind of compare it to every time a crisis hits America. You know, if you look at our coverage of Hurricane Katrina, if you look at the coverage around Trayvon Martin and so many other deaths that have come before, whenever you talk about the media writ large and coverage, there are always obvious gaps and holes in coverage. And I believe that's a reflection because of the newsrooms not having the right people in there to add the proper nuance, to add the proper coverage that is needed to really explain to readers what's happening. And so when you ask me, how do I feel about the coverage of George Floyd? I feel the same way that I felt in previous years, where I feel that there's a lot of great coverage. There is a lot of nuanced coverage that I am seeing, but I feel that we can always do more and do better.
Yeah, Olivia, you're covering protests and, following this story closely here in the city of Detroit. How do you feel about the media's coverage of this, civil rights movement, this Black Lives Matter movement, and the protests that have ensued in cities across the nation, including our city?
Right. When I think of all of the protests that are happening, not just here in Detroit, but everywhere, the Black Lives Matter movement started in 2013. Yeah. And so when we think back to that time, there were reports going out in 2013 that were asking if Black Lives Matter was a terrorist organization, which is crazy. And so now, and there's still reports that are going out with that question. And it's like, when we think about the words that we're writing or the words that we're saying on podcasts or TV or whatever, radio, like those words have meaning. And so it affects the way that the community sees the protest, how it's happening, the people who are involved. And so when we're asking questions like, oh, well, has there been any looting? Or has there been, how many people have been arrested? Those questions matter. And so we have to think about our reporting in terms of how is this affecting the community? What is the community doing to either be involved or what are their feelings about the protest? And so I think that there's been a lot of reporting in terms of there's been a lot of change in the way that protests have been covered, but it's still being covered from the forefront in terms of a crime story, which I think is very troubling.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to see that there have been some changes. I think it was on NPR, there was a stance about how headlines should say a Black man was shot and killed and murdered instead of an unarmed Black man, and just the difference that makes in terms of the reader and understanding the issue. But locally, those little things make such a huge difference. And so I think Bridge Detroit has done a really great job in terms of looking at what the community is doing, how the community is acting, and reporting those stories.
And, I guess cementing how important it is to have newsrooms that are reflective of, the makeup of the cities that they are covering, to add that layer of nuance that non-reporters of color or journalists of color will miss because they just have a different experience, right, Kat?
Absolutely. And just thinking about the city of Detroit, using that as an example, if you are from the city, if you know the neighborhoods, the power players, who the grandma is on that street, the right people to interview, the right questions to ask. You have that perspective that's really ingrained in you to know what's going on in the neighborhood. You're not just what I call parachuting in to get a story and then leaving. You're invested in the community. And in my opinion, that is something that every newsroom should hope for, not even just local news. Now I'm on a national level, and it's like, how do you bring that perspective into national coverage? And it's by still amplifying those voices, still finding the right context and the right people to talk to. So even thinking about, who am I interviewing in these stories? And if you are not using the right voices in your stories, that's a problem. That's why we're going to continue to have this coverage that feels like it's just scratching at the surface and not getting at the underlying issues.
That makes so much sense. Let's talk about facts versus the narrative that we hear from the president and other spaces of power, right? Does that narrative line up with what you know is happening on the ground?
I think a lot about how President Trump lately has really kind of stuck to this law and order narrative that he wants to restore law and order in communities across the country. And what we know what that's doing is that's signaling, he's trying to signal to a certain base. He's trying to signal to these this narrative of the white suburban mom who he believes that they don't want to see crime come into their neighborhoods. And that's how, as Olivia stated, that's how he is painting the picture of the movement for Black lives. But what we know is on the other side, they're saying we're not out here trying to destroy neighborhoods. We are literally fighting for our lives. So I think as reporters, it's on us to provide that. Once again, nuance is my favorite word lately, to share facts. And the facts are that there are people protesting in these streets because they are tired of seeing Black men die at the hands of police. They are tired of seeing police brutality. They are tired of seeing people of color die disproportionately from COVID-19, right? It's not even just about police protests. And so how do you cover that?
Yeah, Olivia, we've been paying close attention to the narrative that has been cascading here in the city of Detroit from the mayor and the chief of police, as well as the president. Does it line up with what you know is happening on the ground and in the streets of the city of Detroit?
Not at all. Just not at all. It's actually really frustrating, especially because, and I can go back to Bryce Huffman's piece on Operation Legend, because the entire, when news broke that the FBI was going to send federal agents here to Detroit, it was really confusing to people on the ground and said, wait, I thought these protests were predominantly peaceful. I thought that people were, really coming together. And now it's like, wait, now we're sending in federal agents. What does this have to do with the protests? And so I think it caused a lot of confusion around what was actually happening here, and really I feel like it was the federal government's way of like trying to take over the narrative and say, well, this is what we're going to do and how we're going to react. And even though it ended up not being about the protests, it was like very confusing and an unsettling time when it didn't have to be.
I want to ask you both about what, the layers that exist in being Black women and journalists covering Black Lives Matter. What's going on with you, Olivia, internally as a Black person, as a Black woman, as a journalist who is expected to put words to an experience that people are feeling and going through, but that you're also going through at the same time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Honestly, I feel very fortunate because I work for Bridge Detroit. So like back to your earlier statement about being in a newsroom that also represents the community that we're covering. I think that is so tremendously helpful just for my own sanity and my own peace, that I know that I can rely on my team, and that if I have questions, like you guys are going to be there for me, or if I am doubting myself or the things that I'm doing, like I can always go back to my team. And I didn't always feel like that in other newsrooms. And so I feel like that's a huge part of it. But also like, I feel very invested in the stories that we're telling, that, I really want to tell stories that reflect the community or are answering the community's questions. Like, it's not just about saying, okay, there was a protest today, this many people got arrested, or this many people didn't get arrested. It's more than that. It's like Kat said, when you think about the neighborhoods, who are the people involved, what's going on in the neighborhood, and how is the protest impacting them, or how are they getting involved in the protest? Like, all of that matters. And so I feel very invested in the stories that we're telling.
These past several months have forced me to rethink journalism and how I approach my own reporting, because I've just been kind of in my head trying to explain what does being objective mean. You know, when you're in journalism school, all they talk about is the notion of objectivity. But what I've really thought about over the past several months is the fact that I am a Black woman first, and I am also a journalist. And I believe that my experiences in America, my experiences in Detroit inform my reporting. It's not a hindrance. And the goal for me as a journalist is to work in a newsroom that allows me to bring my full self into my work to, again, help inform that reporting. So as I've been watching everything unfold, I feel that as a journalist, I have to get it right. And I think about that every day, because the things that we write, the things that we report, it impacts people. It shapes the thought process of people in Detroit and beyond. So I think it's an honor to tell our stories, and I take it so seriously because I know that journalism really does have an impact on people's lives.